In modern information warfare, you do not defeat a false accusation by denying it. You defeat it by reflecting it. On April 19, 2026, Canada did not simply reject a baseless claim from Washington. They handed the United States a mirror, and what stared back was a labor infrastructure crisis the American government had spent decades documenting but refusing to confront. By late afternoon, a morning tweet had been transformed into a formal international inquiry, a diplomatic bluff had collapsed into verified data, and the narrative had flipped so completely that American labor federations, global human rights bodies, and opposition lawmakers were publicly endorsing a foreign investigation into U.S. workplace practices. This was not a public relations maneuver. It was a structural dismantling of a false premise, executed in under 3.5 hours, and it reveals a communication playbook that is already altering how sovereign states manage narrative combat in real time. The collapse began at 6:23 a.m. Eastern, when a Post accused Canada of systemic forced labor factories built on exploitation, modern-day slavery concealed behind progressive policy branding. The language was calibrated. It invoked international human rights frameworks, implied moral authority, and demanded economic sanctions, but it contained zero evidence, zero sourcing, and zero operational specificity. Forced labor carries a strict legal definition under international conventions, work performed involuntarily under threat of penalty. It encompasses debt bondage, human trafficking, and coerced prison labor. By that standard, Canada ranks fourth globally for worker protections. It enforces provincial and federal minimum wages, mandates overtime compensation, maintains independent labor tribunals, and operates robust anti-discrimination employment statutes. The International Trade Union Confederation awards Canada a Category 1 rating, the highest possible classification, reserved for nations demonstrating only irregular violations of labor rights. The United States, by contrast, holds a Category 4 rating, indicating systematic violations. The accusation was not merely unfounded, it was structurally inverted. Yet instead of dissipating into the standard news cycle, it was institutionalized. By 8:30 a.m., the White House formalized the claim, directing the Department of Labor to investigate Canadian manufacturing practices and recommend trade penalties if violations were confirmed. That was the critical miscalculation. Formalizing a bluff converts it into policy, and policy requires documentation. Ottawa's response did not arrive as a rebuttal. It arrived as an architecture. At 9:47 a.m., Prime Minister Carney stood before an assembled press corps and announced a Canadian investigation into forced labor practices within the United States. But the operational shift was not the announcement itself. It was the attachment. A 347-page preliminary report compiled over 90 days by Canadian labor researchers, international compliance experts, and human rights auditors, sourced entirely from American government databases, federal court records, academic studies, and investigative journalism. Every statistic carried a citation, every claim linked to a verifiable record. This was the operational difference between assertion and infrastructure. Washington had constructed a narrative on air. Ottawa constructed a counter-narrative on ground. The report segmented the U.S. labor landscape into 5 documented failure points, each meeting international thresholds for coercion, exploitation, or systemic neglect. Prison labor anchored the findings. Approximately 800,000 incarcerated individuals across state and federal facilities are compelled to work in agricultural operations, manufacturing lines, and state service sectors. Compensation averages between 13 and 52 cents per hour, with several jurisdictions operating uncompensated labor programs. Under international legal standards, when refusal triggers punitive measures, extended isolation, restricted visitation, delayed parole hearings, or loss of rehabilitative programming, the arrangement crosses the threshold into forced labor. The economic output generated by these programs runs into billions annually, yet the labor remains structurally coerced. The second category examined migrant agricultural workers. Roughly 2.5 million seasonal laborers, predominantly from Mexico and Central America, operate within a framework where debt bondage, document confiscation, and deportation threats function as enforcement mechanisms. Federal investigations in Florida and California over the past 24 months confirm systemic retaliation against workers who reported unsafe conditions, withheld wages, or demanded basic hydration and heat protections. Labor contractors routinely charge transportation and housing fees that workers must repay through extended labor, creating cycles of dependency that meet international definitions of modern slavery. The third failure point: quantified wage theft. Department of Labor compliance audits reveal that American employers extract approximately $50 billion annually from workers through minimum wage violations, unpaid overtime, and mandatory off-the-clock labor. 17% of the U.S. workforce is impacted, with low-wage sectors retail, food service, warehousing, agriculture bearing disproportionate harm. Most violations remain unreported because workers face immediate termination, industry blacklisting, or immigration enforcement. The fourth category addressed occupational safety. The United States records roughly 5,000 workplace fatalities and 2.8 million non-fatal injuries each year. OSHA maintains approximately 1,500 inspectors for 10.5 million active work sites, producing a ratio of 1 compliance official per 5,600 locations. Enforcement capacity is statistically overwhelmed. Inspection intervals span multiple years, and penalty structures routinely fail to deter repeat violations. Advanced economies with comparable industrial output maintain significantly lower fatality rates due to higher inspector density, mandatory safety engineering standards, and collective bargaining oversight. The fifth, and most politically volatile, was child labor. In 2024 alone, federal investigators documented over 5,000 minors working illegally in meat processing plants, manufacturing facilities, and agricultural operations. Children as young as 13 operated heavy machinery, managed chemical exposure, and worked overnight shifts. Companies like Packer Sanitation Services faced multi-state citations for deploying minors in hazardous roles across regional supply chains. None of these findings were speculative. All were sourced from American regulatory bodies, federal court dockets, and congressional oversight reports. The institutional validation arrived before the press conference concluded. Within 2 hours, the International Labour Organization issued a formal statement noting that Canada's documented concerns aligned with decades of ILO monitoring and compliance tracking. The UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery explicitly classified U.S. prison labor conditions as meeting the international definition of forced labor, citing the absence of voluntary consent and the presence of punitive enforcement. The International Trade Union Confederation, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International publicly endorsed the investigation, offering archival documentation and compliance data to accelerate the review process. American labor organizations followed immediately. The AFL-CIO and SEIU released coordinated statements acknowledging that Canadian labor standards exposed structural gaps in U.S. worker protections and welcoming external scrutiny as a catalyst for domestic legislative reform. Congressional responses amplified the shift. Senator Bernie Sanders confirmed every cited statistic as consistent with federal oversight findings. Senator Elizabeth Warren framed the original accusation as psychological projection, noting that the accuser had documented the exact vulnerabilities present in his own jurisdiction. Even Senator Mitt Romney, while cautioning against foreign investigations of sovereign labor policy, acknowledged the factual accuracy of Canada's documentation. The narrative had fully detached from Washington's control. Attempts to recover only accelerated the structural collapse. At 2 p.m., the original accuser dismissed the Canadian report as fabricated, attributing it to partisan media and opposition-aligned unions. But the citations were not drawn from advocacy groups or political research firms. They were sourced from the U.S. Department of Labor Compliance Database, federal appellate rulings, OSHA enforcement logs, and publicly accessible congressional hearings. Denying the data required denying the government's own administrative records. By 3:30 p.m., the State Department issued a defensive statement asserting that U.S. labor standards meet international requirements, yet it avoided addressing a single-sided statistic because refutation was operationally impossible. At 14 million, Canadian trade officials clarified the investigation's commercial implications. If U.S. imports prison-manufactured goods, agricultural products tied to exploited migrant labor, or items linked to verified child labor violations were produced under coercive conditions, Canada would initiate import restrictions, mandate supply chain audits for Canadian distributors, and coordinate with European trade partners on compliance benchmarks. The original demand for sanctions had reversed into a threat of market exclusion. The accusation did not merely fail, it redirected. What unfolded in those 3.5 hours was not a diplomatic accident. It was a calculated application of information strategy. Speed established narrative dominance before opposition framing could solidify. Evidence neutralized denial by anchoring claims to the accuser's own administrative data. Framing shifted the burden of proof from the accused to the originator. When Washington projected a vulnerability it did not possess, Ottawa responded by exposing the vulnerability the accuser actually carried. The result was a public reckoning that bypassed partisan filtering because the source material was institutional, verifiable, and domestically generated. This is the operational baseline for modern geopolitical communication. Bluffs collapse when met with receipts. Narratives fracture when anchored to auditable data. And in an environment where information propagates at network speed, the side that controls documentation controls the outcome. The investigation remains active. Trade implications are being modeled against existing bilateral agreements. International labor bodies are coordinating oversight protocols to align findings with multilateral compliance standards. Domestic legislative pressures mounting as union federations, compliance auditors, and oversight committees reference the Canadian report in hearings and policy briefs. Every subsequent move will be evaluated against the standard established on April 19th. Respond before the narrative calcifies. Source rigorously from administrative records, and never defend against a mirror by attempting to shatter it. If you analyze geopolitical strategy, information warfare, or the intersection of policy, compliance, and public perception, subscribe. We break down how states navigate modern narrative combat: zero speculation, zero padding, only documented analysis and strategic breakdown. Full source citations, regulatory references, and tracking links are available in the description. Stay sharp.